There is a very familiar pain that many people carry their entire lives. Not because they have never tried, not because they are lazy, but because they have failed and then begun to doubt themselves. I have met people like that everywhere. People who once held great hope, then watched everything collapse in silence. They do not fall at the moment failure happens. They fall afterward when they ask themselves, maybe I'm not good enough. I want you to understand something very important. Failure is not life's final blow. It is like a turn in the fog. You are not falling off a cliff. You simply cannot yet see the road ahead. I remember my early years when everything I touched seemed to go nowhere. I worked hard. I hoped a great deal, but the results were not proportional. And in the quietest nights, I too asked myself, where's the problem? Much later, I realized failure did not come to teach me how to quit. It came to force me to change who I was. Like a ship at sea, when a storm hits, the issue is not how high the waves are, but whether the compass is still pointing in the right direction. Many people think failure is the storm. In reality, it only exposes that their compass has been off course for a long time. In this video, I am not here to tell you how to avoid failure. I am not here to comfort you with empty words. I want to show you how to turn today's failure into the foundation of tomorrow's success, not through luck, but through inner growth. Because your future is not determined by what happened, but by how you interpret and respond to it. And you should stay until the end of this video, because the final mindset may completely change the way you see your life. The first principle, failure is data, not a verdict. There is a very common mistake people make when they fail. They do not just look at the result, they let that result define who they are. When a plan does not work, they say, I failed. When a job falls apart, they say, I'm not good enough. But you see, those two statements are dangerous not because they are sad, but because they immediately close the door to learning. I learned this fairly early in life, not from books, but from my own mistakes, very real mistakes. When I was young, there were years when I worked and the results were almost zero. Income did not increase. Opportunities did not open. And if I am honest, what hurt most was not the number in my wallet, but the feeling of I tried and still went nowhere. Then I realized something that completely changed how I viewed failure. Failure does not come to condemn you. It comes to give you information, like when you cook. If the dish does not taste good, it does not mean you throw away the kitchen. You simply ask, did I add too much salt? Was the heat too high? Did I skip a step? Failure is the same. It is simply saying, there is something in the way you think, decide, or act that needs adjustment. I once met a man who worked a salaried job for many years. He was diligent. He did not complain, but his life was almost stagnant. Every time his work was not recognized, he said, this market isn't fair. My boss doesn't see me. The problem was not that he failed. The problem was that he never read the data from that failure. He read it as a verdict. On the other hand, I have met people who failed very early in business. They lost money. They made mistakes. But they sat down and asked very different questions. Where did I misjudge people? Where did I lack discipline? Where was I lazy in my thinking? Same failure. One person gained bitterness. The other gained wisdom. I remind myself of this whenever things do not go according to plan. Do not insult failure with complaint. Respect it with reflection. Because the moment you treat failure as data, you take back control of your life. You are no longer a victim of circumstances. You become a student of your own life. And once you learn this first lesson, you are ready for the next principle. A principle very few people dare to face because it does not blame circumstances, it places responsibility directly on you. The second principle, life does not reward effort, it rewards change. There is a very common belief that confuses people for years. They believe, if I just try hard enough, life will automatically get better. I used to believe that, and I have met thousands who believe the same. They start earlier. They finish later. They endure more. They sacrifice more. Then one day they sit in front of me and say, I tried so hard and my life still hasn't changed. I understand that feeling. Because there were seasons in my life when I worked very hard, yet the results were almost motionless. And it took a long time before I accepted a very hard truth. Life does not pay for effort. Life pays for becoming. You can double your effort, but if you remain the same person, you are simply running faster on the same road. Imagine you are pushing a cart with a misaligned wheel. You can push harder. You can push longer. But if you do not stop to fix the wheel, all your energy creates exhaustion, not progress. Failure often appears at the exact moment to tell you this. It's not that you need to do more. You need to become someone different. I once met a young entrepreneur. He worked almost without days off, but his business constantly faced problems. Unreliable partners, employees leaving, money slipping away. He told me, "I've done everything I can." I asked him a very simple question. "Who have you become in the process?" That question made him silent, because we often focus on what we do and forget who we are becoming. Failure does not come to criticize your effort. It comes to point out that your effort is being directed by an older version of you. A person with an old mindset, working hard, will only produce old results. A person with low standards, trying harder, will only reach the limits of those standards. I had to face this in my own life. There were times I realized it was not that I lacked motivation, I lacked discipline in my thinking. It was not that I lacked dreams, I lacked standards high enough to keep me aligned. Failure is like an unforgiving mirror. It does not care how long you have tried. It only reflects. This is who you have become up to this point. And the moment you understand that, you stop complaining. You stop comparing. You begin to ask more mature questions. What do I need to upgrade in my mindset? Where do I need to learn to make better decisions? What areas of comfort am I allowing to exist in my life? I have seen this again and again in people who truly changed their lives. Not the moment they worked more, but the moment they set a new standard for themselves. An employee who decides not just to complete tasks, but to become the most reliable person in the room. A business owner who decides not just to earn money, but to become someone who keeps promises in every circumstance. A student who decides not just to pass exams, but to build a long-term foundation of thinking. You see, when the person changes, the results have no choice but to change as well. I often say to myself, don't wish for an easier year, wish to become better. Because if you become better, you do not need favorable conditions. You can move through conditions. Failure, at its deepest level, is not a sign that you should quit. It is a signal that your current version has reached its ceiling. And that ceiling is only broken when you accept change, not your schedule, not your environment, but the person inside you. When you understand this principle, you will no longer ask, "Why have I tried so hard and not succeeded?" You will begin to ask a far more powerful question. Who do I need to become to deserve that success? And that question will lead you to the next principle, a subtle but life-defining truth. The way you interpret failure will determine your future. The third principle, the way you interpret failure will determine your future. There is a truth that very few people are willing to face because it takes away their most familiar excuse. It is not failure that hurts you. It is the story you tell yourself about that failure. Two people can go through the same event, lose money, miss an opportunity, stand in front of a door that is just closed. But 10 years later, one is bitter, the other is mature. The difference is not in the circumstance. It is in how they interpreted what happened. I have witnessed this many times in my life. Some people fail and say, "I'm not smart enough. I'm not lucky. This life isn't for me." Those statements may sound harmless, but they are like arrows shot straight into the future. Because when you believe them, you shrink yourself. Failure, at that point, is no longer an event. It becomes an identity. I once met a man who failed in business at a very young age. He lost almost all the money he had. For many years afterward, he always said, "I'm not cut out for business." And do you know what happened? He lived exactly according to that statement. He avoided opportunities. He chose excessive safety. He did not allow himself to try again. Not because he lacked ability, but because of the label he attached to his failure. On the other hand, I have met people who experienced equally severe failures, but they said very different things. "I learned something very expensive. Now I know what not to do. I haven't succeeded yet, but I have not lost." Do you see the difference? Failure is like a piece of land. If you plant bitterness in it, you will harvest fear. If you plant curiosity and humility in it, you will harvest wisdom. I had to learn this lesson in a way that was not comfortable. There were seasons when I looked back at my life and thought, I've wasted too much time. But then I asked myself a more important question. If I keep telling that story, who will I become 10 years from now? And I realized the way I tell the story about my past is quietly writing the script for my future. Many people are not trapped by failure. They are trapped by the version of themselves they created from that failure. They say, "I tried before, it didn't work," but they do not realize that that sentence closed the door before they even knocked a second time. Failure, if you allow it, will become your most honest teacher. But if you interpret it incorrectly, It will become a quiet dictator whispering in your mind every time you want to move forward. I often tell myself, be careful with the stories you believe, because you will live inside them. An employee passed over for promotion can say, they don't recognize me. Or he can say, I need to become impossible to ignore. A student who fails an exam can say, I'm not intelligent. Or she can say, I didn't study the right way. Same event. Two completely different futures. Failure does not ask you a complicated question. It asks very gently, do you want to be a victim or do you want to be a learner? I have observed that the people who truly change their lives are not those who avoid failure, but those who redefine it. They do not say, failure destroyed me. They say, failure showed me where I needed to grow. When you interpret failure as a reminder, you keep your self-respect. When you interpret it as humiliation, you lose belief in yourself. And the most dangerous part is this. When you lose belief in yourself, you begin to accept lower standards. You choose smaller goals. You compromise more easily. You stop demanding more from yourself, not because you cannot do better, but because the story you tell does not allow you to. I want you to remember something very important. Failure has no voice. You are the one who lends it one. And if you can change the way you speak about failure, you can change the direction of your entire life. When you learn this principle, you will begin to look at failure not with fear, but with clarity. Because you know that no failure is powerful enough to destroy you unless you allow it to define you. And right here, we move to the next principle, one even harder to accept, because it does not talk about thoughts, it talks about the standards you are accepting every day. The fourth principle, failure reveals the standards you are accepting. There is a question very few people dare to ask after failing. Not because it is difficult to understand, but because it is too honest. That question is, what standard in my life allowed this result to happen? Most people ask different questions. They ask, why did this happen to me? They ask, who disappointed me? They ask, what circumstance blocked me? But failure does not care about those questions. It simply stands there and reflects one thing. What you are accepting is creating your life. Standards are not what you desire. Standards are what you allow to repeat. You may desire success, but if you accept procrastination, mediocrity, leniency with yourself, that is what is actually controlling your results. Failure is like a very precise measuring tool. It does not measure your dreams. It measures the standards you live by each day. I had to face this in my own life. There was a time when I wanted more, better income, greater respect, a stronger sense of control over my life. But when I looked honestly, I realized my work standards were average. My discipline standards were inconsistent. My responsibility standards had many gaps. Failure did not come to shame me. It came to say very clearly, the outer life perfectly matches your inner standards. This is true in every area. An employee says he wants promotion, but he accepts being late sometimes, accepts doing just enough, accepts not preparing thoroughly. Failure in promotion is not injustice. It is the logical result of the standards he lives with. A business owner says they want growth, but they accept small compromises every day, ignoring details, accepting unreliable partners, accepting half-kept promises. Business failure, then, is not bad luck. It is an exact copy of what they allowed to exist. Standards are like the temperature in a room. If you set it low, do not be surprised when the room stays cold. You can complain, you can protest, but only when you raise the temperature does everything change. Failure often appears when life says, it is time to raise your standards. But many people miss that message. They try to fix the result without raising the standard. They want new results with old standards. And that is a request life never accepts. I learned this. You cannot live a first-class life with second-class standards. When I began raising my standards, standards of discipline, standards of speech, standards of how I used my time, everything began to change. Not immediately, but irreversibly. Because when standards change, behavior must change. And when behavior changes, results have no choice but to follow. Failure, at its deepest level, does not ask you, what do you want? It asks you, what are you willing to tolerate? And that question, if you are brave enough to answer it, will move you into an entirely new stage of life. If you are listening to this and feel these words touch something inside you, I invite you to stay with us longer. This channel does not promise a fast path. We walk only with those willing to raise their mental standards and build life from the roots. If you find conversations like this valuable, subscribe as a way for us to continue the journey together. Not loudly, not for show, just the right principles, repeated long enough to create real change. When you understand that failure is pointing to the standards you accept, you are ready for the next principle, a subtle but decisive one. Discipline is not born from motivation, but from deep reflection on failure. The fifth principle, discipline is born from failure that is deeply understood. Many people believe discipline is a matter of willpower. They think if I were strong enough, I would be more disciplined. If I were determined enough, I would do better. But after many years of observing people, I realized a very different truth. Discipline does not come from force. It comes from deep understanding. No one sustains discipline long-term through emotion alone. Emotions come and go. Motivation rises and falls. What remains is clarity, and nothing makes a person clear faster than a failure they are willing to sit down and truly understand. There were seasons in my life when I did not lack motivation. I read, I listened, I felt excited, but my discipline was scattered. I started many things, but I did not sustain them. I made many promises to myself, but I was also the first to break them until I went through failures deep enough that I no longer wanted to repeat them even one more time. Not because I hated myself, but because I respected my future. Failure, when you do not reflect on it, leaves only disappointment. But when you look straight at it, it leaves something far more valuable, clarity. You begin to see very clearly, if I continue living this way, this result will repeat. And in that very moment, discipline begins to form, not as a punishment, but as an act of self-protection. Like someone who has once touched fire, no one needs to remind them to be careful anymore. They understand the cost. I have met people who told me, I don't have discipline, but when I asked deeper questions, I discovered they had never truly reflected on the consequences of that lack of discipline. They felt tired, but they had not clearly seen the connection between the small choices of today and the larger life of tomorrow. Failure helps you see that connection in a way that cannot be denied. An employee who is repeatedly passed over for promotion, if he only feels sad, he will not change. But if he sits down and realizes, every time I'm late, every time I do mediocre work, I am voting against my own future. From that point on, discipline is no longer forced. It becomes a conscious choice. A business owner fails not because of a lack of ideas, but because of a lack of consistency. If they only blame the market, they learn nothing. But if they look directly at the days, they ignored details, delayed decisions, and compromised with ease. Discipline will appear as a natural consequence. I learned this. Discipline is not about doing what is hard. Discipline is about not wanting to relive old pain. When you truly understand what failure has taken from you, time, opportunity, self-respect, you no longer need anyone to push you. You wake up earlier. You prepare more thoroughly. You control yourself better, not because you become rigid, but because you become mature. Discipline, at that point, is no longer a sacrifice. It is an investment. I often ask myself, is this action protecting my future or sabotaging it? That question does not create emotion. It creates awareness. And when you live in that state of awareness long enough, discipline becomes part of who you are, quietly, without needing to show off. Failure does not create discipline. Understanding failure does. When you understand the lesson deeply enough, you do not need to remember to be disciplined. You simply no longer have any other choice but to live better. And right here, we move to the next principle, one that confuses many people because it reverses common thinking. Future success always requires you to pay the price first. The sixth principle, future success always requires you to pay the price first. There is something many people do not like to hear, but life keeps repeating it. No success comes without a bill. The issue is not whether you must pay. The issue is, when will you pay and with what? Most people want success, but they want to pay later. They want results first, then they will think about discipline, responsibility, and growth. Life does not operate that way. Life says very clearly, pay first, then we can talk about reward. Failure often appears precisely when you try to reverse that order. I have seen many people say they want a better future, but they do not want to accept discomfort in the present. They avoid learning. They avoid responsibility. They delay necessary decisions. Then, when failure happens, they are surprised as if life has treated them unfairly. But failure is not unfair. It is simply the receipt of previous choices. I had to learn this lesson in a very direct way. There were seasons when I wanted to go further, but I did not want to trade my comfort. I wanted better results without the discomfort of changing habits. I wanted higher income without greater responsibility. And then failure appeared, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough for me to understand I was avoiding the price. Life is like a very fair vendor. It always places the product on the table with a clear price attached. You can buy an easy life today, but you will pay for it with regret tomorrow. Or you can buy a disciplined life today and harvest freedom later. You do not get to choose not to pay. You only get to choose what you will pay with. Failure helps you see that truth quickly. It says, if you are not willing to pay up front, you will pay long term. I once met a man who told me, I just want a stable life. But what he truly wanted was to avoid the discomfort of growth. He avoided learning new skills. He avoided difficult conversations. He avoided looking directly at his weaknesses. Life gave him exactly what he chose, a life that was not too hard but never expanding. Failure did not come to punish him. It came to ask one simple question. Are you willing to pay for a better version of yourself? A business owner who fails often says, if I had more capital, I would have succeeded. But very few are willing to ask, if I had paid with discipline, with patience, with learning from mistakes, would I have been different? I learned this. Success is not a reward for desire. It is a reward for willingness to pay the price. And failure is the tool that measures how ready you truly are. If after every failure, you only want to return to your comfort zone, that shows the price you are willing to pay is still too low. But if after failure, you are willing to sacrifice ease, willing to take more responsibility, willing to step into discomfort, you are entering the territory of growth. I often ask myself, what is this price buying for my future? That question completely changes the way I view difficulty. Difficulty is no longer an obstacle. It becomes the condition for progress. Failure, at this point, is no longer a sign that you are on the wrong path. It is a reminder that you have not yet paid enough for where you want to go, and when you accept that truth, you no longer fear failure. You only fear avoiding the price that must be paid. The next principle, and also the final one, will complete this entire picture. Because after all the failure, discipline, and price paid, there is only one thing you can truly control. You do not fix circumstances, you upgrade yourself. The seventh principle, you do not fix circumstances, you upgrade yourself. There is a very common illusion that exhausts people for years. They believe that if circumstances change, their lives will get better. If the market improves, if the boss becomes fairer, if opportunities come sooner. But I have learned not from books, but from life itself, circumstances rarely change first. People must change first. Failure often appears when we try to fix the outside world without looking at the world within. We want new results with the same old mindset. We want a different life without becoming a different person. That never happens. I have been there. There were times I thought I just needed one more opportunity, a better relationship, more favorable circumstances, and everything would be fine. But then I realized an unavoidable truth. Life does not respond to my desires. It responds to the person I am being. When I upgraded my thinking, I began making different decisions. When I raised my standards, I no longer accepted easy compromises. When I strengthened my discipline, I became reliable first to myself. And do you know what happened? Circumstances began to change as a consequence. Not because the world became kinder, but because I became capable enough to handle a more difficult world. Failure, at its deepest level, does not ask you to fix everything around you. It asks you to answer one single question. Is the current version of me enough to create the results I desire? If the answer is no, failure does not tell you to quit. It tells you to upgrade. Upgrade how you think when facing difficulty. Upgrade how you respond when things do not go your way. Upgrade how you use your time, energy, and words. A person who cannot control their emotions will blame circumstances. A mature person will upgrade their self-control. A person weak in discipline will hope for favorable conditions. A strong person will become steady enough not to need favorable conditions. Failure does not ask you, were the circumstances fair? It asks you, who did you become in those circumstances? And when you begin focusing on upgrading yourself, you no longer feel powerless. Because no matter what the world looks like, there is still one thing always in your hands: the person you choose to become. Let us look back at this entire journey. Failure is not the enemy. It is data, a mirror, the most honest reminder of who you currently are. Life does not reward blind effort. It rewards real change. The way you interpret failure is quietly writing your future. The standards you accept each day are determining how far you will go. Discipline does not come from force, but from understanding deeply enough that you no longer want to relive old pain. And future success always requires you to pay first with growth, responsibility, and courage. In the end, you do not need new circumstances. You need a new version of yourself. Because when the person changes, the results must change as well. If this video gave you a moment to reflect, take a second to press like. If you want to continue walking with thoughtful perspectives, subscribe to the channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it, because sometimes one correct perspective can change an entire life. I want to ask you one question before we end. After the failures you have experienced, who are you becoming, and are you satisfied with that person? I will leave you with that question, because as I often say, success is not something you pursue. It is something you attract by the person you have become. I truly appreciate that you stayed until the end of this video.